Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging session at Octane 20 Live. As you know, Okta is a public company, so any forward looking statements that we share here are subject to change. So please read the safe harbor note in detail at your leisure. My name is Madhavi, and I work with a large group of Octonauts to drive our diversity, inclusion, and belonging efforts. Okta is committed to building a culture of inclusion and belonging while we create a balanced team to fuel innovation and collective growth. For me, the terms fuel innovation are very critical in our vision because this demonstrates that we are committed to inclusion and belonging, not just because it's the right thing to do, but we understand that that's the smart thing to do. That is something that will help us drive our competitive and innovative advantage forward. And today I'm super excited that our three employee resource groups, Women at Okta, People of Color, and Pride at Okta, got together to bring us this discussion on how each one of us can build a sense of inclusion and belonging on our teams. And for this discussion, we have a very special guest with us, Aubrey Blanche, who's the Director of Equitable Design and Impact at Cultivating. Aubrey is a very influential and inspiring leader in the D&I space and has initiated the conversation of rethinking diversity and inclusion as balance and belonging. Welcome, Aubrey. We are so excited to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and excited to meet, although I think we meant in person originally, but it'll happen.
It will happen. We are making the best of what we have right now. Cool. So let's start a little bit about learning more about you. So how did you get interested in the D&I work? And given the fact that it is definitely very rewarding work, but it's also very emotionally tiring. So what keeps you motivated and going on a daily basis?
Yeah, so I have a little bit of a, I guess I would say non-traditional career, although I usually just say it only makes sense in reverse. But I used to be a journalist focused on water, energy, food security, and actually went to get a PhD in political science focused on terrorism and military strategy. So a little bit different from D&I.
Yeah, but that's something that I guess we share in common. I did get a PhD in political science too, and I was like, this is an odd career choice transitioning to D&I, but looks like it makes sense for a lot of work that we do.
I think it does. And I have to be honest, you finished, I dropped out. But I think there is something really common about the methods. So I dropped out, landed in a tech company. I didn't know a lot about tech culture, but I started asking questions like, why is everybody so white? And the answers I got didn't make mathematical sense. So when I heard from folks that tech was a meritocracy, I knew that that wasn't statistically possible. And so I started asking more questions. And I was lucky that there was a leader at the company that was open to having me look at the way that bias might be, interacting in a company and then fixing those problems. And then, from there, I spent 5 years building and scaling the diversity and belonging practice at Atlassian. And a couple of months ago, I joined Culture Amp to not only help them scale in an equitable and ethical way, but to help their thousands of global customers do the same.
Cool, that's interesting. I'm sure Culture Amp would be super excited. I did attend Culture First last year when they were in San Francisco, so it was a great learning opportunity. I think one thing that I took away, or I should say, was inspired by or stole from Culture Amp, was the belonging pins that they had. So we put that together for some of our events as well. So that was a great takeaway from Culture First. So this is, you definitely have a super interesting background, but we are also in very interesting and unprecedented times. I do see your recording from your film, which I'm sure was not in the plans, but I also feel like given the work that we are in, this is a moment that is helping us humanize a little more. So what do you think about that? And how are you holding up given like these unprecedented times?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I mean, these moments are certainly humanizing. So for folks who can see behind me, fun fact is I moved right before a lot of sort of the change came in. So I'm not actually even calling you from my kitchen because I don't yet have Wi-Fi at home. But if there's anything that makes real life feel real, it's that. And I think in some ways, a career in DEI has prepared you for that. It's constant change. I'm personally holding up, and I think what's really motivating me right now is remembering that leaders' legacies aren't built on meeting quarterly earnings reports multiple quarters in a row. That legacies are built by doing the right thing and the human and the compassionate thing in difficult times. And so that's helping me, but I would hope that it also helps other leaders who are trying to lead in what is a time of unprecedented uncertainty, which is that you will be remembered for being human, not being perfect. I will also admit, I certainly have, debilitating bouts of anxiety as well. So I'm not all roses and sunshine. And I think it's okay for us to acknowledge that as leaders, we're not perfect either.
Cool. Yeah, that's a great point. One thing that I've seen change a lot, like people earlier would like have calls if they were working from home and lock their rooms. And now they have like their cats and their dogs and their kids like on the Zoom call. Everybody's interacting. So that to me is such a great, the community coming together. So hopefully some bright spots that we can find during this time. Cool. Let's jump into one question that I have for a very, very long time wanted to ask you. You have talked about rethinking diversity and inclusion as balance and belonging. Can you define these terms for us, and why do you think it's important to rethink these concepts?
Yeah, so I think the high level answer is that I don't think these words actually describe the goals that we agree on. So back in 2018, Atlassian did some research, and what we found was that the word diversity, while the dictionary definition means difference, the constructed meaning of that word largely means white women and Black Americans. And that was even internationally. So in Australia, more Australians said that African Americans were, quote, diverse than Indigenous Australians, which is a little strange, right? I think it's not hard to argue that there's more Indigenous Australians in Australia than African Americans. And so I think that when I want to talk about balance, because using the word diversity has gotten to us in a place I don't think we intended. So because the word diversity is so associated with white women, what we've seen is that almost all of the progress that we've made has accrued to straight, white, cisgender, economically privileged women, often at the explicit expense of Black women. And so I think I like to call it corporate white feminism. But I don't think that the word diversity actually gets us to the outcomes we want. And I think the obvious reason that balance is more useful, I think I can explain it in an example. I've talked to leaders, really well-intentioned folks who are very on board with this, and they say, look how diverse my team is. And half of their team is white women, which is not a bad thing. I think we can recognize that white women face significant sets of challenges, but that they may not be as extreme as those that their sisters of color or queer folks face. And so using balance actually helps us overcome that. We can say, great, I'm so excited that you've achieved gender balance. And how is your team doing in terms of racial balance or the balance of people from different abilities? And I think it's also just kind of intuitive, right? Like no one's going to die on the hill of advocating for an imbalanced team. That sounds pretty silly. So I think it gets us away and allows us to embrace intersectionality. It's intuitive and it helps embrace intersectionality in a way that's easier. And then on inclusion, I guess the simple way to say it is inclusion isn't good enough. So it's kind of like speaking, as a queer woman myself, it's kind of like someone saying, oh yeah, we tolerate gay people. I, as a queer Latina woman, don't want to be included in a space that was designed and prioritizes the experiences of straight, white, cisgender men. One, because I'm never going to be that thing. What I want is to actually be welcomed into a space where it has been designed for all of us to thrive, which means that I would have a sense of belonging. And I think the last thing is belonging is a core human need. So I think it starts from a place of empathy because no matter how many majority groups someone is from, the fact is they have been in a place in life where they didn't feel like they belong, and they can use that insight about themselves to more deeply understand what we're trying to interrupt for our folks who have been historically marginalized or minoritized. So yeah,
That's
and who doesn't love a good B&B?
Yeah, that's true. That's super interesting. I guess that also shed some light on your job title, which is Equitable Design and Impact. So it's like designing those spaces and those processes which are equitable rather than we
Mm-hmm.
design it for a group and then we welcome another group into it.
Yeah,
Is
exactly. And the impact half of it is really important. I think a lot of times, you know this, in the DEI space, people often say, well, I had good intentions. And I totally believe that. But the fact is, you don't get credit if your intentions didn't happen. Um, the simplest connection I have for that is I always say the car insurance company doesn't care if you didn't mean to hit that other car. Um,
that's
and so and so for us, it's really about both designing something for equity, but then holding ourselves accountable to making sure that it happened and taking feedback and adjusting if our intentions got misaligned with what we meant with the impact that we had.
That's so true because as it said, like what's measured gets done. So if you're not measuring the impact, then it's not making much change. Uh,
Exactly.
to the next question. This is I read a few of your pieces where usually it is considered like creating these spaces and working on diversity and inclusion. It's basically the role of a dedicated DNI team or the DNI head. But I've heard you talk about like every job is a DNI job. Um, can you elaborate on that? What do you actually mean when you say like every job is a DNI job?
Yeah, so I think that people often think that diversity and inclusion is an and to your job. And what I want people to think of is it's a how. So certainly, I think working sort of in a dedicated D&I role like I do, but I think of myself as an enablement function. So ultimately, a business leader is accountable for whether or not they do pay equity auditing in their group. A recruiter is accountable for whether or not they're intentionally sourcing out a balanced pipeline of candidates. So I would say to someone who says, well, I don't know what to do, think about what you already do all day in your job and how that impacts the business. And then think about the ways that you can use that work to create more access and fairness. So I think one of the examples I use is a CMO, right? Making sure that you're mentoring a balanced set of people. Make sure that you are doing pay equity audits and requiring audits on promotional velocity and your performance scores. Are you making sure that your brand reaches a diverse audience set? These are things that are already within your power to do, often in partnership, right, with your head of diversity. But I can tell you that the most incredible chief diversity officer in the world will never get anything done if everyone doesn't understand that is their job and their ethical responsibility to do this work.
So, Aubrey, as you said, there are sometimes great intentions, and a lot of DNI leads put in amazing programs for companies, but a lot of implementation needs to happen on the side of the teams. And so, what can DNI leads do to help the teams understand what they can do better and not create a sense of like a conflict there, but more create a sense of partnership that the DNI leads can support and guide while the teams can do a lot of implementations for these strategies to come together?
Yeah, I think that there's often kind of a misunderstanding. So I guess I can start with what we as leaders can do, which is be really explicit and tactical. So often we say things like, well, we need our leaders to empower women. And they say, well, what should I do? Buy Dove deodorant? And I don't think they understand necessarily without guidance exactly what they're doing that's leading to the not correct outcomes. So I think as leaders, we should be specific about what behaviors we want to see. But I think at the end of the day, team leads and leaders also need to take responsibility that the outcomes for equity on their teams are their responsibility. So for me, if I could give a couple of tips to folks, institute a no interruptions rule in your meeting. Did you know that women were 3 times more likely to be interrupted while speaking? Are you very simple, but it also is basic collaboration skills, right? This is not some big social justice warrior issue. It's simply making sure everyone is heard. Or thinking about the fact that you maybe unconsciously spend more time, informal time at work with people like yourself. As a leader, can you make sure that you're providing mentorship and coaching to a broad set of people and being intentional about that? Can you make sure that when you give feedback to individuals, it's specific, action-oriented, and based on behaviors? Because research shows us that women are given feedback on their personalities, while men are given feedback on their skills and abilities. And I think if anyone heard that, you're like, oh, well, that's just basic good management. And my answer to that is absolutely. And now I think there is something that's important, which is leaders, in my mind, it's a job performance issue that they begin learning and growing on these issues. I don't think any of us expect perfection. But the idea that someone just throws their hands up and says it's too hard, to me, is not an acceptable thing to say. These are the same people who are saying that they want to make $100 million in revenue a year, and understanding the Black woman experience seems a little bit less hard than that.
That's so true. And I usually, when I look at this and people are like, okay, there is a lot that I'm doing in my day job, but adding this on is too much. And sometimes I say, you're not doing this just for D&I. You're doing this to become a better manager. It's like just learning, going to a class where you're learning better managerial skills. It's part of that, rather than you're just doing this for a moral good of I want to be fair to a diverse group of people on my team. But I'm like, this is just good management experience and training that you need to go through. So definitely a great point there. And I think that helps us sell a lot of the trainings and a lot of the changes. That's what I've seen in my experience as well. Let's shift gears to a few questions that were submitted by our employee resource groups. So The first one is from Pride. So our Pride group has a question, which is, do you have any specific tips for being inclusive with regard to social gatherings in countries where what we are celebrating, in this case, the LGBTQ community, where it is either against law or is very strongly socially opposed? So how do we bring this community together and be inclusive as well?
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated question. When I was at Atlassian, we were certainly operating in countries where there were very different social attitudes towards the LGBT community. And I think my first tip is defer to the community about what feels safe for them. So I know that in one office, we didn't want, our sort of queer folks didn't actually want to have big public celebrations. And so while that would have been the way that we did it in other offices, we really prioritized what the community was raising to us. The second thing that I would say is that there's a difference between agreeing with something or, being openly supportive and being respectful of colleagues. So for us, we did this through leaders who were supportive, but we made it very clear that disparaging comments, that harassment or disrespect towards members of the LGBTQ community was a job performance issue and constituted harassment under our company policies. So definitely, I think dealing with legal issues is important. But even in a country where something like that is illegal, I think companies can simply make the decision that derisive comment towards anyone is unacceptable and is an employment concern. So I think that when you're dealing with much more difficult things, for us, we had private Slack channels. So for LGBTQ employees only, to create safe spaces for them to talk. We provided our Pride t-shirts to that office for anyone who wanted to wear one. And what was great about that, the feedback that we received, was it wasn't just our LGBT folks who were wearing the t-shirts, but there were people who were supportive of the community and wanted to be allies. And it was a small thing they could do to wear our Pride t-shirt to say, I'm a person who stands up for this community, even if in my society it's something that we're still making progress on. So again, first, go to the community and ask. Second, recognize that it's okay that cultural celebrations look different, but they keep the same spirit. And three, be really clear with folks what's expected, which is not that you need to drape yourself in a rainbow flag, but that you must be respectful and thoughtful to your colleagues, regardless of their background or identity.
Nice. That those are such practical tips. And we face that a lot, even across different states in the US where we have offices.
Mm-hmm.
The social acceptance is so different because we are headquartered in San Francisco, which obviously looks very different from a lot of other places in the United States. Our next question is from our people of color group, which is around the retention.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, it's a two-part question. So first is like, what are the flags that we can identify that can help us raise concerns before people of color leave an organization? And the second part of it is, what are the traits of an environment that we can create in our workplace where people of color see opportunities for career growth, career advancement, they feel like they can stay at the company longer? Because there is usually the piece, and this is not generally specific to Okta, but generally in the tech space, we have seen that a lot of companies hire people of color because they have some diversity numbers or quotas. But then it's a revolving door. They feel like they don't belong and then they leave. So what can we look at in terms of red flags with regard to retention and the best practices to retain people of color specifically?
Most extremely impacts people of color. So the first question is, what proportion of your D&I budget is spent on marketing and PR versus internal programs? And not you specifically, but I think that metric, in my experience, is most predictive of whether people of color thrive, because the fact is, you cannot undo institutional racism with an ad campaign. And I think we're all in agreement on that. So I think that's the first thing is, are business leaders empowering heads of D&I to spend money on programs that have long-term impact, not short-term impact? And that means spending money on internal culture versus marketing. In terms of the way that I tend to help business leaders understand is they should be looking at promotional velocity. So that's analyzing time to promotion as well as sort of percentage of a given group that is being promoted. Because what we know is that because of multi-step selection effects, right? Basically, we know that the educational pipeline is biased. We know that recruiting processes are biased, often against underrepresented people of color, that when you don't see people of color moving up, it actually means that you likely have a biased process in terms of promotions. So I think that is where you should start. The second thing that I say is be really, really clear and documented with how growth opportunities are assigned and promotions happen. There's two good things about that. First, it helps create structure for the deciders so that those unconscious biases are less likely to creep in than they would otherwise. But also, it levels the playing field, because the fact is, people from majority groups often have inside information on how a process works. If you democratize that information, you're taking away the unfair advantage that people from majority groups have had for a long time in the business world. And the last thing I would say is making sure that your ERGs both are focused on creating social connection and community, which is non-negotiable, but that they're also empowered to professionally develop each other. So whether that's they're bringing in speakers, they're doing, collaborative work together. But I would say making sure that ERGs are set up to support people both interpersonally as well as professionally, because we know that the better networked underrepresented people of color and people of color more broadly are, the more effective they are at both staying in the workplace and then advancing in terms of their careers.
Nice. Thanks for that. Those are like really practical tips. And I love the fact that it's not just creating a sense of community, but also the personal empowerment piece of it as well.
Yeah.
The last question is from our Women at group. So, what are some of the critical choices that you have seen women have to make for their career advancements? And what can teams and team leads do to support that process?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really difficult choices that women have to make. I think one of the first ones, quite frankly, is how seriously we take on sexist feedback that we're often given. So when managers say something like, and I'll speak as a Latina, people have often told me that I'm overly emotional, whereas if I were a white man, I would have just been passionate. And I think that's the first thing is we say, well, do I take the feedback on because I'm in an environment that sees me that way? Or do I push back in a way that could damage my relationship? So I want to acknowledge that. But I think that I would actually like to offer a neither path, which is that I think that we can get really good at asking for clarification in ways that start to interrupt the bias-based barriers that we exist. So for someone, going back to that feedback example, I often say, can you describe the behavior that's giving you that impression and what behavior you'd like to see instead? Could you show me someone on our team who is exhibiting those behaviors in a different way from me? And what I've found from that is when you're asking for specific examples, there's two benefits. One, maybe you can uncover some useful feedback about ways to show up that will make you more successful. And then two, it might become more clear to the person giving the feedback that they're giving feedback from an impression and not an actual sort of empirical fact. And I think that the second choice that women often have to make in their careers that can trip them up if they don't think about it correctly, I think this impacts you as you move from the mid to senior level of your career the most, although I think it's useful for everyone, which is we confuse being ourselves in our careers with being the same version of ourselves in every space in our career. So I show up a little bit differently with my team who I manage, the team of my peers, and with my CEO. And none of those versions are the fake version of me, but they're a different version of me. And so I think that sometimes when we're not intentional about which version of ourselves we're going to be, it can feel like we're playing and we're being forced to be not a version of ourselves. And so I think that we as women in the workplace are really served to think about who we want to be in those situations and how it fits the need of the moment, right? I perhaps come across a little less bubbly in executive meetings than I might, when I'm hanging out with our ERGs, but both of those are versions of Aubrey. They're just the right version of Aubrey for the moment. And so I would encourage women to think about that as how do you create multiple authentic versions of yourself so you don't feel like you're covering yourself when you're at work, if you can.
That's such an interesting point because usually when we create different versions of ourselves, which you said are suited for the occasion, but we self-doubting, are we faking it? Are we not being true to ourselves? And that's a lot of mental chatter that takes a lot of energy away from us. These are amazing practical tips. Aubrey, before we close, I want to leave our audience. We might have hiring managers, team leads, individual contributors in the audience. Can you share a couple of practical tips that they can put into place, like when they're going back to work tomorrow and days after that, that they can put into place for building a culture that's more inclusive and a greater sense of belonging on their smaller teams rather than looking at this from like the organizational perspective?
Number one, look at who you get information from. So check out the writers you read and your social media feeds and rebalance it if you're primarily listening to people from majority groups. That's building bias into your brain that's going to make it harder for you to treat people fairly. Number two, be intentional about sharing something you know across a line of difference. So if you happen to be in the majority group based on your race or your sexual orientation, think about something that you know professionally that you could make an effort to share with people from a group that's less advantaged than you are. And three, intentionally create space for the voices of people who are different from you. So even as simple as in a brainstorm saying, hey, Nia, I haven't heard your opinion yet, and I'd love to know what you think. That is doing the work of creating belonging. It's not about draping yourself in rainbows all the time. It's about creating space for other people who may not be able to take it for themselves because the world isn't giving it to them. You have the opportunity to open up that access. And I would argue you have the obligation to do it, not just because it's good for them, but because it makes your team more effective.
Thank you so much, Aubrey. Those are practical tips. And I should say sometimes, even though I do D&I work, I forget some of these. So these are obviously great reminders. And I definitely feel a lot of this is such a learning journey for all of us. And I always say, like, we can measure impact, but we'll continue to learn along the way. Thank you so much, Aubrey. This was a super interesting conversation. We have a lot more to talk about. So I hope we'll continue to have these conversations and hopefully have you over at Okta for more discussions.
I would love it. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for everyone who's tuned in. And you can follow me on Twitter at Aubrey Blanche. If you have questions or want to follow up, I'd love to answer them. And I promise we'll get that tea soon.
Cool. Thank you so much, Aubrey. It was great chatting with you. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.